Okay. Good afternoon. The parlor of First Presbyterian Church, Durham. For those of you who don't know, I'm Jerry Postema, a long time, what is it now, 40-year member of this congregation. And sitting next to me is a good friend of myself and of Presbyterians around this town, including a good number from First Presbyterian as well as from Trinity Ave Presbyterian, Daniel Greyber, Rabbi Daniel Greyber. It's really good to have you, for us to be together. Rabbi Greyber and I did a conversation on an easy text last time on the binding of Isaac. And so we chose to go a little harder this time. The aim, I guess, or the subject is, you might say, to whom or to what can we go to find meaning in suffering? That's a pretty difficult subject. And so we picked an easy book, the book of Job, to deal with that kind of issue. Job is full of puzzles and problems and challenges. But my 30 years worth of obsession with it, I can't say close study, but obsession with it, has just forced deeper and deeper thoughts on the matter. Are there answers to that question? Where do we go to find meaning in suffering? I don't know. There may be more challenges than answers, or challenge to trying to find answers. I'm not sure. That will emerge. There are three kinds of problems that this book is often thought to raise or address. The one I was first drawn to, of course, was the philosophical one. I'm a long-time philosopher. And the philosophical one is just, is it possible for there to be a God who is all-powerful, all and perfectly just, and evil to exist in the world? That's the so-called inconsistent triad. And philosophers from a long time have struggled with that. They've sometimes come up with attempts at a theodicy, they call it. That is an attempt to justify God's actions to human beings. That always struck me as an odd way of thinking about it. But in addition to the philosophical problem, there really is the theological problem. The theological problem is, look, we learn about God in our scriptures. And there are things like God's overwhelming creative power and God's providence. And in our tradition, and I think in Rabbi Greyber's tradition, a very important theme of covenant. And yet, how do you square that with the existence of evil and things not going, or as Jeremiah put it, how come the wicked prosper? That's the theological problem. Job raises, I think, in the even the most profound way, another problem. I call it the personal or existential. I think Rabbi Greyber, you and I called it the religious as opposed to the theological question. But that's the question of how can we fit the experience of suffering into a life that has meaning? How do we fit our relationship with God into a life with suffering? Or how do we fit suffering into that? And most palpably, the book of Job seems to raise that problem. We'll see how these develop over time. Maybe you want to say a word about the way these issues, the book of Job, has been addressed. And,
yeah, although you said there were three things. I heard
philosophical problem, theological problem, and the personal existential.
The personal, okay. Okay, thank you.
He's taking notes.
All right, I was. The chance to study with Jerry is a blessing, and so I take notes whenever possible. So I want to say how wonderful it is to be here. And what can I say? God has a way of bringing things together. I'm here sitting next to not only to Jerry, but to Reverend Joe Harvard. And it was 12 years ago today when one of my best friends from swimming growing up in Potomac, Maryland, David Knauer, of blessed memory, died. And he was a PhD student in religion at Duke and a member with his family, with Lee and their kids at First Presbyterian Church. And it was his death that brought me first to Durham, although I think I have a vague memory of doing a swimming meet here when I was a kid. At some point, we made the 4-hour trip down, but I'm not going to count that. So it was David's death that brought me to here. I was taken care of by Joe, by his beautiful the way he conducted the funeral and brought the community through that. And the next morning I went to Shabbat services at the local conservative synagogue and found out that they were looking for a rabbi. And I enjoyed the services, and it led me to apply and brought me in the end to Durham to live. So it is very poignant, and perhaps that story, as much as anything else we're going to talk about today, teaches us about the personal aspects of these things, the way that we draw threads from moment to moment to create a story that creates meaning, that gives us strength to move forward. So it is really, I say without exaggeration, it's a blessing. This moment is a blessing to be here, and every time I have the chance to study together in this community, it's a blessing. I want to say a couple of words of introduction about the book of Job in the Jewish tradition. The first one is that it's a good thing that we're studying it, because Jews don't study it very much. And I say we don't study it very much. You can tell that because it's not part of our regular liturgy. It's not what's called a haftarah. A haftarah is a section from the prophets or the writings that we read after reading the weekly Torah portion. So it never shows up in Jewish liturgy. There's never a day when it's read as a liturgical text. And that's a shame, and why that is, I'll leave for greater scholars than I. But it's a text that you have to go out of your way to study. There may be reasons why the rabbis said, well, it's in the Bible, but let's not spend too much time looking at that. So that's number one. On the other hand, and for those of you who didn't have a chance before, and I'm going to hold it up, I commend to you a book called The Book of Job, When Bad Things Happened, in the past tense, to a Good Person. That may sound an awful lot like a much more famous book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. When they were written by the same person, the same author. Rabbi Harold Kushner wrote a book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People, which came out of his personal experience losing a child, and in which he wrestles with the book of Job. And it's a book that's been translated into dozens of languages and reprinted thousands of times, reprinted into thousands of copies And it's a very, very important book that has brought a tremendous amount of comfort to people all around the world. This book is put out, it's part of a series called the Next Book series, and it's actually a series of biographies of just different people and different subjects. And Kushner essentially came back after about 30 years after writing his first book, and this is a study of the book of Job that really walks you through. And I find this to be tremendously insightful and helpful, and so I commend it to you. And it'll inform a lot of what I have to say, and I think, it informed Jerry and my discussions. The setup that I want to offer about the book of Job, and after this, I'll turn it back over to Jerry. Well, after this, we'll look at some of the, we'll turn it over to Jerry, who's going to talk about the structure, and then we're going to look a little bit at the fable and some of the insides of the book. That's what we're going to do today. The other thing which I want to talk about is sort of its place in the Bible. And here, Micha Goodman, who's an Israeli scholar, suggests the following. Isaiah 58 is a haftarah. It is an important liturgical reading on Yom Kippur, on the holiest day of the Jewish tradition. It is one of two major fast days in the Jewish tradition. And for one of two major fast days in the Jewish tradition, and by the way, the most well-known of the fast days, Tisha B'Av, is less observed during the summer. For that day, the rabbis chose Isaiah 58, which contains a critique of the fast. Okay, it is the only one of 929 chapters in the entire Hebrew Bible that contains a critique of the practice of fasting. Not to say you don't have to do it anymore, but what Isaiah says is, you're getting this all wrong. You're fasting and you're bringing me lots of sacrificial animals, but you're forgetting that what that's supposed to inspire you to do is to feed those who are hungry and to take care of the poor. That's what I want the fast to accomplish. And so the Bible in that moment, and the rabbis emphasize it, offers a critique of the very sacrificial system that is set up in order to achieve forgiveness for the Jewish people, for the Israelites in the temple. Okay, and what Goodman argues is that the book of Job essentially offers a critique of the critique. In other words, if there is a system, and it's probably too simplistic to say it this way, but if there is a system, if the Bible first offers the sacrificial system and says, if you want to please God, then here are the sacrifices that you should offer in this place on these days, and that will provide atonement. And I say it's not so simple because obviously the Bible doesn't have in mind that you only do these things. They should be accompanied by and should inspire certain states of mind, etc. But if that's the system, and then Isaiah offers the critique of the system, Job, the book of Job, argues Goodman, maybe the critique of the critique, which is to say, what if acts of justice and righteousness themselves don't work anymore either?
Mm-hmm.
Because what I want, and we'll look more closely at the opening chapters of Job, but the important thing to note is, or one of many important things to note is, the Bible has no problem holding up biblical figures who are flawed. Okay, King David, the greatest king, you could indict him for murder and adultery. Okay, two of the great sins in the Bible, and pretty easily he'd be found guilty. Moses gets angry and hits the rock. Probably that's a harder case to make, okay? But Jacob, who we are in the middle of reading about again, is crooked, okay? He lies to his father, does this ruse with his mother, Rebecca. He is a cheat, okay? And that's what his name means. Yaakov means crooked or cheat. Okay, so the Bible has no problem saying that we have flawed individuals. And with Job, the story, at least the fable, goes out of its way to tell you that Job is an ish tam. He is, and the word tam, he is a perfect man and is Yireh Elohim. He fears God. There are only there's only two people who are described, two men and I'll say three people or three or four people who are described as God-fearers in the Bible. Abraham, after the Akedah, just to bring the things together, is described as one who fears God, and the Hebrew midwives are described as God-fearing. That's it. Okay, and Job, right, and Job. So he's described as perfect and God-fearing. And so what the Bible is offering us here is somebody who is the ideal, the personification of essentially Isaiah 58. He is the personification of someone who takes care of the poor. Many times the story goes out of its way to tell you that, who is not a sinner, who is good, and who is yet afflicted by God. And it raises the question of whether or not this works, right? Do acts of justice work, or is not even that adequate to protect us from suffering? And so as we are reading this, the last thing which I'll say about this is I find it very comforting that the Bible and rabbinic tradition will follow in this, although I'm not going to go into that, but I find it comforting that the Bible contains within it its own critique. And I do think that that's one of the reasons that the rabbis included this in the canon, to say that we live in a world, as Rabbi Kushner said, we live in a world where bad things happen to good people. And there is no recipe. And the book of Job is here to remind us that there's no recipe. Let me stop there and turn it back over to Gerald.
Yeah, so that's very interesting, because I was just going to say just a few words about the Christian tradition with respect to this. A couple of things. One, there's a famous passage in the book of James that many of us are familiar with, which just holds up Job as the paragon of patience, the patient and pious Job. It goes something like this: we call blessed those who show patience. You have heard of the patience of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. They hold up the first chapter and a little bit of the end of the second chapter of the book of Job. Don't do anything with the challenge that goes on in the middle of it. I have a strange penchant for reading obscure work on Job, and one of the things that came into my possession many years ago was a copy of all 159 sermons of John Calvin, our Presbyterian Maimonides. And I found it I haven't read them all, but 159 of them given each day for a long time. When I said this, they said all 159 on one day. But what you get in this Protestant Reformed tradition, I just wanted to pick out two things. One is the assumption that the text is all one. You don't drop anything out, you keep it all together, and it's got to make sense as a whole. I like to drop out the fable and talk about the middle. Calvin said, don't you do that. We'll get to this issue later. The other is, of course, in Calvin's theology, not unlike in Islam, the emphasis is on God's, what we call God's sovereignty, God's overall transcendence, and God's rulership of the world. It's not a theme unusual for Judaism as well. So the key then is to try to fit that fable story into a story about how the whole thing fits together and how God's providence is shown throughout it. When we pick up the fable, I'll give you a little bit about what his view is. But I found in his opening sermon this wonderful juxtaposition. What he says is Job made a good case in the middle. So he talks about the middle. He's going to give 159 sermons, so he's got to talk about some of those speeches in the middle. And he says, Job gives a good case, the friends give an evil case. Job's case was good because it's right to think that God does not always punish strictly according to the measure of sin. God has secret purposes that are also at work. He made a good case, says Calvin, but ill-handled it. Because what he did is he stood up there arrogantly and demanded things. Karl Barth, your friend, the 20th century, again, Reformed theologian, said Job was right to insist on his righteousness before God. He was, however, wrong in shamelessly demanding that God be righteous before him. So we'll deal with this kind of struggle, I think, later. So within the Christian tradition, there is sometimes an attempt to just drop out all chapters after chapter 2. Bart and
I have to say,
Calvin.
it reminds me, we invited Joe to come and share the pulpit one synagogue, one Saturday, and we happened to be reading the section about the tabernacle with all the instructions that reads like something out of Home Depot. And I said to Joe, so what do Christians usually do with this? And he said, we usually skip it.
That's right. Yes, and so there's a lot of skipping, but you're right. And I think now 20th century theologians, Christian theologians, and lay people are inclined to say we better read this, the interior, and not just the opening chapter, where Job's patience and Job's integrity, Job's piety, Job's righteousness is held up. There's a whole lot more that's going on. We'll come to that in a moment. What I wanted to say also is that there are two other themes that run through these works. One is the connection to Abraham's testing. Job is tested, and there's an inclination to see that what's going on in at least the famous story, a testing of Job as well. And I think there are echoes of that in the Jewish tradition.
Yes, the rabbinic tradition strongly connects. And by the way, going back to something that I said, that both Job and Abraham are described as Yireh Elohim, as God-fearing. And they're the only two men, right, who are described that way. So the rabbinic tradition will closely connect Job and Abraham.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's interesting. The other thing you will not find in the Jewish tradition is that Barth and Calvin are willing to see Job as a Christ figure. Because of the description in that beginning. He's perfect. He is close to God, and they see him as a kind of forerunner, a kind of witness to what they will see in the New Testament. Not a surprising kind of move for Christians to do with respect to Jewish texts, Hebrew Bible text. Okay, if we can move on a little bit to the book itself. Most commentators on the book of Job are willing to agree that this is a literary masterpiece. It's complex, it's nuanced, but it is not a theological treatise. It's not didactic. It's not linear. So it's more like a parable, except that it's a parable over a large number of chapters with a lot of poetry in the middle. But a parable in the sense that it's going to teach you something, but you're going to have to work at it. You have to work at it to get at what that meaning is. And while there is in chapters 38 to 41, in effect, God's coming in, it's not a Deus ex machina. That is, we don't get, oh, now we know the answer by looking at what God says in the speech in chapter 38. Or at least it's open for us to think about what that speech indeed will do next time, what that speech really amounts to. To see it as, well, it's all building up to God saying, now here it is, now go take this in your pocket. It's not a theological treatise. And for my money, we need to put the whole thing together and to see that sometimes it's doubles back on itself. I find really troubling the last 7 verses of the book, which it seems to me turns everything upside down again. Calvin didn't. So what I think is really important is that we have to be mindful not only of the content or the words that are said and the concepts that are put together, we got to think about the tone, especially the poetry. And that requires a whole lot more, worry and challenge. So the book, in the chat, there is a document called The Structure of the Book of Job, which you might just find helpful to have in front of you for a moment. The book of Job actually is built in terms of a kind of opening tale and prologue and a closing tale, epilogue. And in the middle are all the many speeches between Job and his friends and a couple of interpolations. And then God comes back in chapter 38. So what you get is the prologue, the first 2 chapters, the epilogue, which is the last maybe 7 or 8 verses of 42, and then a whole bunch of stuff in the middle. And as I see it, the dialogues begin with a soliloquy by Job, and then exchanges between Job and his 3 friends. And then it ends up with another soliloquy of Job's in verses 29 to 31. There's an important transition between the prologue and the poetry, where the friends are introduced. Interestingly enough, the friends are not talkative at that point, but they're introduced. And at the end, what you have is in the verses 7 to 9 of chapter 42, you have, again, the friends are addressed, but now by God. So there's a kind of transition back into the epilogue, which tells a tale of restoration of Job after the suffering he has gone through. What we will try to do here today is to say a little bit about that opening fable, the prologue. A word or 2 to say about the epilogue, but maybe not. And then after we've done some real careful look at that, I want to just identify, we together, some main themes in Job's speeches, though I will need a background for some of the friend speeches, just very, very briefly. I want to look at some of the chapters, because one of the questions we've got to ask from a literary text like this is, how do these parts fit together? How can they make sense as a whole? And a lot of us want to say, drop out this and drop out that, because that just makes things confusing. And I'm inclined to do that in a couple of places. But we need to struggle with their inclusion and their being together as a single entity. So why don't we start, you want to comment on that first?
Yeah, I'll say one thing about that, and then we can jump into the prologue. And I hope people have in the chat, I think we put the altar document for chapters 1 and 2.
That's the translation by Robert Alter of chapters 1 to 3, actually, or opening at 3.
Yeah.
Just what I'll look at that.
So let's just make sure it's in the chat, but we can leave. I'm going to have people follow that on their own, because if we share screen, it'll be whatever. The one thing which I want to say, I'm going to encourage us also, as Rabbi Kushner in this book makes the argument, and I think it's important that while in the end God says to the friends, you have not spoken well, they're not straw men, and they they develop over time. And I think it's useful for us to look at the different arguments and to ask ourselves, which of those might be useful to us in certain moments, and which of them are just downright awful. I am what I'll call a theological pragmatist. I'm not. I think at a certain point wanted to understand the answer. Maybe in closer to my youth, and I was disabused of the possibility of finding that answer, and have come to believe that that theology should be measured based on its ability to provide comfort to people. And so, for example, there are people for whom Rabbi Kushner's book is very unsatisfying, because his argument is that God is not in control of certain aspects of suffering, and for some people that is unsettling and deeply disturbing, and that and it does not bring them comfort. And I'm not interested in disabusing people of that notion. I will quietly and gently remind them, that there are alternatives, and that if at certain points that belief becomes something that's painful or paralyzing, that they should know that there are alternatives, and that they should know that they're choosing that as a theology, and it certainly has a lot of grounding in the text, but it's not the only one, right? And I think I'm interested in evaluating theologies and arguments based upon what's useful. I don't want to jump ahead to it, but I think that there's some powerful theologies that the friends do offer, and there's a reason that they offer them at the start.
So just a word on that. Again, Calvin, as I said, Calvin said, Job made a good case, but was arrogant. The friends made an evil case, but the evil wasn't in the theology that they were expressing. They made use of it. So the other point is, Calvin himself says, look, there's good theology there. It's just that it's good theology and not very good pastoral counseling. They used it badly. They, in fact, thrust Job into despair. Right. It is. I'm inclined, on the whole, to dismiss the theology as conventional wisdom, but I think that we can have a conversation about how to go deeper on that. Okay, good. So now let's talk about the folktale. We will, so that's our main task for today.
All right, so hopefully you have a copy of the folktale, and we'll read a bit through it. I'm going to say one thing to set this up, which can be helpful. We're going to begin with Satan, or Satan is how you pronounce this in Hebrew, and we can spend a long time talking about that. This is not the Satan with pitchforks and the whatnot. As Kushner points out in the book, the word Satan in the Hebrew Bible can either mean something about an accuser, someone who accuses. In rabbinic theology, it becomes a character who is accusing the Jewish people or accusing various characters of not being as righteous as they should be. And in this story, part of what the Hebrew shows us is that in chapter 2, when God, I'm just jumping ahead, that Satan comes along to present himself, and God says to Satan in Hebrew, Vayemer Adonai el Satan, mizeh tavo, right? Where have you been? What have you been up to? And Satan answers, Vayan Satan et Adonai Vayomar, and he says, Mishut ba'aretz. So the shoot means sort of scouting out, but it's actually the same two letters that form up, two of the three letters and the important ones that form up Satan's name. Okay, so the idea being that Satan has been out scouting around, right? And you can get where the idea of accusing comes from, because a really good way to accuse people is to gather information, negative information about them, right? And so that's sort of a whole other semantic element to Satan's name. The point that I wanted to make at the beginning is that in this introduction, Satan doesn't believe in Job, in Job's goodness, and God does, right? God fundamentally believes in Job's goodness, and that's why he takes the bet, as it were. But as the story unfolds, it's Job's friends who don't end up believing in him, in his goodness. And so the friends take on the role of Job in some ways. They become his accusers.
The role of Satan.
Yes, Satan. The friends take on the role of Satan, his accusers, and Job takes on the role of God, right? Because Job essentially believes in his own goodness, right? And in the intermediary, in those middle chapters, God will sort of drop out as Job is doing the hard work, right? And that may help just in terms of our understanding of the relationship between the parable and the poem. So we begin, a man there was in the land of Uz, and I have to say, by the way, that teaching this in the presence of Jack Sasson is a little intimidating. He's done us the service of turning off his camera, but Jack is one of the great Bible scholars living in the world, and I'm sure has a lot to say about this. So please correct me when I get it wrong, Jack. Or chime in, but this is a fable opening, right? And Alter says this in his commentary. These initial words signal the fable-like character of the framed story. The opening formula: a man there was, in Hebrew, ish haya. Right. By the way, the book of Esther that Jack wrote the Anchor Bible commentary on, it begins ish haya b'shushan habira, right? In a very similar way. A man there was in the land of Uz, Job his name, and the man was blameless and upright, right? Tam and Yashar, and feared God and shunned evil. Also notice this, and 7 sons were born to him and 3 daughters. 7, that's a nice round number. 3 is another, right? 7 plus 3 equals 10. That's another nice round number, of number of children to have. And his flocks came to 7,000 sheep, right? Another set number of 7. And 3,000 camels and 500 yokes of cattle and 500 she-asses and a great abundance of slaves. And that man was greater than all the Easterners, and his sons would go and hold a feast in each one's house on his set day, and they would call to their sisters to eat and drink with them. And it happened when the days of the feast came round that Job would send and consecrate them and rise early in the morning to offer up burnt offerings according to the number of, sorry, my pages are off. Where did it go? Them all.
No, that's not it.
No, hold on, I'll find my page.
Yeah, hang on.
Thank you. Okay. The number of them all. For Job thought, perhaps my sons have offended and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job would do all the time. Job is not just a good guy for himself. He is preemptively atoning because, by the way, when you get a bunch of sons and daughters and sisters together and they have a big feast, you know that there may be some inappropriate things said and done, right? When the kids go out to the bars at night. And so Job wants to make sure that everybody is taken care of. This is a perfect man, right? As I said before, he has achieved the prophetic ideal. And one day the sons of God came to stand. So now we're taken up to the, I don't know where we're taken up to heaven, right? And the image here, this is part of the ancient Near Eastern theology, is that the God has a retinue, right, of gods around, of lower gods, or B'nai Elohim is a term referring to servants in the divine retinue, came to stand in attendance before the Lord, and the adversary too came upon them. So Satan is part of this heavenly court. And God said, where do you come? From where do you come? And the adversary answered the Lord and said, from roaming the earth and walking about in it. And the Lord said to the adversary, have you paid heed to my servant Job? Now, what's the problem with that, by the way? I'm really asking the people, what is the problem with God turning to Job and saying, have you paid heed to my servant Job? What?
To Satan.
To Satan, saying to Satan, have you paid heed to my servant Job? For there's none like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil. What's the matter with God saying that?
It invites him to attack Job. It goads him to attacking Job.
It goads or invites him to attack Job. In other words, why does God have such a small ego that God needs to show off Job? Right? This is very problematic. Right? The image of God that we have here, of God needing to show off, right? Even if he's showing up, this is inviting it. By the way, the rabbis about the Akedah, and I do think that there's a lot here in terms of rabbinic understanding. If you notice, the Akedah begins the following way. It says, Achar ha-devarim ha'ela, after these divarim, which is translated most often as things, but divarim in Hebrew is words. It's both things and words. And so the rabbis imagine a whole conversation that's taking place. And one of the conversations that's taking place is between Abraham and himself, right? That Abraham says, you know what, maybe I'm not such a good guy, right? Maybe I've done some things, but also between Satan and Abraham. Right, and I think it's built exactly from the book of Job. The rabbis imagine that Satan goes up to God and says, that guy Abraham, he's been having all these feasts. He's not such a good guy, right? And God says to him, if I asked him to sacrifice his son, he would do it. And that's what prompts the sacrifice. So the rabbis put those two stories right next to each other, that there's something in this need to prove yourself, right, which creates this. And here it's put right into the words of God.
So recently read someone who took off on that and said, well, it's not God who needs to know. It's that God knows this stuff, but it's not, as it were, public knowledge. And so what God wants to do is make sure that it's public knowledge. And he's got his man to do the publicity, rather gross and cruel, but he's got the man to do the publicity. I'm not sure that that's the way to go with it. You can see how attempts to harmonize might go in that direction. I find the God of the fable to be weak, has sort of weak self-esteem, and needs to prove himself.
I hear what you're saying. I think that I go in that direction. Also, I think that the idea that in Jewish tradition would be called Kiddush Hashem, right? A sanctification of God's name, which is often associated with martyrdom, but this greater idea, this idea of, in some ways it's in the Bible itself, right? That God's goal is to create, but then to have people come to worship. And so it's this larger project of God, right? In order to create that world. I'm not going to read through the rest of the fable, but Job loses everything, right? And God says to him at the end of this paragraph, I'm putting all that he has is in your hands. By the way, the other things that I'll point out is that in the fable, we also at various times will learn that Job is he's righteous. Again, he's not just wealthy, but he atones for his kids, but he also has an open table, right? He's also constantly, he is feeding those who are poor. He is taking care of those who are in need. And again, demonstrating that prophetic ideal. The one other thing which I'll point out from the Hebrew is this question, which is, let me just find it. I think it's in verse 10, is the word chinam, right? It says for nothing, right? And is it verse 9 or verse 10? It's verse 9. Hachinam yarei Eov Elohim. Is it for nothing, right? Does Job not have good reason to fear God, right? It's this accusation that, he has everything, right? He has everything that he needs. So it's very easy, right? The accusation here is that it's very easy. And then, by the way, God will come back later on in chapter 2, verse 3, and say to Job, Vayomer Adonai el Hasatan hasamta libcha el avdi. God said to Satan, have you noticed my servant, wait, did I get this right? Hold on. Hold on. Yes. For nothing, right? You have incited me against him to destroy him for no good reason, right? So the accusation of Satan is, hey, he's good for, but there's no good reason that he's good because he has everything. And then God says to him, you made me do this, right? For no good reason, because look, right? He kept up his part of the bargain, right? So in some ways, this is, it's very carefully put together, right? To set up these dichotomies. Jared, let's turn to you. I want to leave us time. This always goes really fast. Take us through some of the.
Well, let me just respond to that first, and then we'll go into the rest of it. Of course, Job responds by saying, naked came I from my mother's womb, naked I return. What the Lord gives, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord. Then there's a second.
Which, by the way, I should say, that is the one place where the book of Job makes its way into the Jewish liturgy.
Right.
At the Jewish funeral, we pronounce the blessing, a blessing that declares God the God of truth, a judge of truth. And then we do say, God has given, God has taken, right? That there Job makes his way into the Jewish liturgy, the one time of the funeral.
So there are two interventions by the Hasatan. The one, God says, you have within your power everything that is his. And then he comes back, and as you reported, God says, but you made me do this for nothing. And Satan says, yeah, but touch him. And God says, okay, you may even touch him, but do not take or spare or protect his life. It's at that point that Calvin turns the whole thing into a story. The story is of God's testing of Abraham, in this case, I guess it's Job. God's testing of Job by design, Satan was not, in Calvin's reading of this, Satan was not a goader, he was an instrument. In fact, at one point, what Calvin says, it's amazing. God was to Satan as the judge is to a hangman. He was acting on commission. He was out there on commission. What was he commissioned to do? To test Job. And to test Job, to show that this was a testing of Job and within the scope of God's providence, Calvin says. He said to Satan, don't take his life. And what they and others after Calvin as well said in this tradition, what they said was, that means there are limits to what God will subject people in their suffering. There are always limits to God's allowing of suffering. That's the goodness of God's providence. Suffering will come. God comes in because he will always protect you from the suffering you cannot endure.
So let me add one more thing as part of the, I think it's important that in terms of our communities.
Yeah.
Jewish theology changes after the Holocaust. Right. And Rabbi Kushner writes about this, where he essentially says that any theology which is offered, has to be a theology that you can offer to parents who have lost a child, and has to be a theology that you can offer to Holocaust survivors and to people about the Holocaust. And I mention this now because there's a teacher named Rabbi Kalman Kalanimus Shapira, who becomes known as the Eish Kodesh, which means holy fire. He was the rabbi of Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. And he offers a teaching actually about, the rabbis notice that Sarah dies immediately after the Akedah. And the teaching that he offers is one from kashrut, from the laws of keeping kosher. He says, you put salt on meat in order to make it kosher, right? Because it takes the blood out of the meat. But if you put too much salt on meat, it spoils it. And that what he says is that Sarah actually dies, and this is the closest you will ever get in the Jewish tradition to the mention of suicide. But he essentially says that Sarah gave up her life as a protest against God, saying that that God had gone too far with the Akedah, and that, in the words of the Eish Kodesh, that there was too much salt, right, and that it spoiled the meat. And so, what you're describing, I think, is a theology that works for a long time. What I would say, maybe not as well as we think it did, right? But that for modern Jews, all theology changed 70 years ago.
Yeah, and while I said that was,
and it's part of what we wrestle about, right? With this,
yeah, and this was an attempt by that particular theologian to make sure that we could have a text that was integral, that you could see it already starts not with God being weak and goaded, but one who was in control the whole time. You can then go through all the business of the dialogue, and he comes back at the end of the story and restores everything. That's fine. There is a unification of it. For my money, the fable is a way of setting up a very different problem. The problem is, you read these two chapters, and Job comes off and he says, yeah, I know, I'm suffering like crazy. Blessed be God. So, wait a minute. That can't be. Who could, going through all of that, simply say that? It's psychologically, maybe even religiously. Impossible, right? And so the writer of this whole book, I'm inclined to say, says, wait a minute, we've got to learn what Job was really doing, thinking, struggling. And so you get the whole ugly struggle in the poetry and the response to it. But what that means is that there's a kind of discontinuity between the story. I mean, one thing you know in these speeches now is that nothing of the setup trial or the wager or whatever it is has any place, is never recognized. Job doesn't know about it. The friends don't know about it. No one knows about it. And in fact, it doesn't come back into the story again, even at the end.
And part of the challenge of the book is that the only people who know about it are the readers.
That's right. Exactly.
And the fact that the readers know about it makes the book impossible. And it's what makes the book the critique of the critique or the critique. Right? Because within the book, you know, whatever resolution you may find, knowing that this is what provokes God, I think makes the rest of the book in some ways impossible. But take us through the.
That's right. So
yeah.
let's do a little bit, if we can, of the interior dialogue. I'm going to focus on chapter 3, which is at the end of that first document that you will have available with chapters 1 and 2. I'm going to look at a few verses in chapter 3 that's on that document as well. Chapter 9, a few verses here and there, and chapter 23. All right, that will be enough for us for today. But in order to get that going, let me just, being a bit unfair because we have to go so fast here, unfair to the friends, let me set up what I take to be part of the argument that it finds in the friends' speeches, and then look at Job's discussion as in part responding to that, but also responding to other closely related matters. So the friends' argument, without going into some of the more interesting theological detail, goes something like this. It's important to keep these things in mind when we think about the whirlwind speech later in the next time. One, God is utterly transcendent. God's all powerful. God has created all, and God is still the sovereign ruler of all. God is perfectly good. God, because God is utterly transcendent, God is beyond all human knowing. Again and again, the weakness of mortals in understanding their world is played up. But here's the key. Nevertheless, though all of God's goodness is taken as the premise is also we know nothing about God's operation or how God's goodness works out. Nevertheless, they're convinced that because God's rule is good, God's rule is just. And here's the rule of justice. The rule of justice is good people get rewarded and evil people, the wicked, get punished. They know that. Because they know that, and they know the other stuff, how do you resolve it? Job, I know you're suffering, you're guilty. That's the only conclusion they can come to. You're guilty. Or perhaps a little bit more sympathetic, God is trying you by fire. Purify. Sometimes they talk about that kind of thing as opposed to strictly punishing.
Well, I don't want to jump ahead of where you want to be, but Eliphaz's first argument is a little different. Mm-hmm. So Job, first of all, I commend everything to you, but the opening words of chapter 3 are extraordinary.
Yeah.
Essentially a death wish, and giving voice to these feelings of despair. And what for me, one of the things I didn't say at the beginning is, although finds its way into the liturgy very little. In some ways, it's a very, very Jewish book, because this tradition of giving voice to despair, and that not being treif, right? Not being not okay, is very Jewish. The permission to ask questions. Eliphaz's response, his first response, and Kushner describes this, if you look at chapter 4, verse 7, right, it's a nice summary of it, where he essentially says, or verse 6, is not your piety, your confidence, your integrity, your hope? Think now, what innocent man ever perished? Where have the upright been destroyed? Which is sort of blaming the victim, right? But essentially what he's saying is, look, your integrity should be your piety should be your confidence, because in the end, you're going to be okay, right? Kushner describes this as your mid-story. Okay, I know that it feels this way all the time. And what I think the thing that I want to hold out here is, again, to Kushner's point, that is a theology that I think can be helpful and productive for people, right? I will say for myself that, one of the reasons that teenagers are particularly susceptible to suicide, and if not suicide, then to extreme measures, is because it's the first time they experience things. And when it's the first time that you experience deep loss, you don't know that you're going to be okay. And the second and third time, the way in which I experience loss now is very different from the way in which I experienced loss 15 years ago. And so I think, there's something to this, there is something to this theology that I think can be helpful and important, which is maybe not the part about, what innocent man ever suffered, in other words, you deserve what's happening to you, but in the end, it'll be okay. But the second part, in the end, it's going to be okay. You're going to be okay. Even, that part of it is helpful. Even if the reason you're going to be okay is because you're righteous, and therefore there's still the corresponding connection between, punishment and sin, and goodness and reward.
So that theme does come up elsewhere as well in the spring speeches. I think what's his name? Bildad also says something like that. That is, let's take a longer view. We've got to have a longer view. And one of the things I really want to stress here is that I want to highlight certain themes which we then may or may not encounter again when we look at the Lord's speech in the world. And one of the things you learn is, you get stuck in the suffering. The suffering itself makes it difficult for you to see that which can be seen if one didn't have that.
It's difficult to see what?
That there is something beyond the suffering. So, and that's what I think is so powerful about chapter 3. What Job says, he didn't curse God with his lips, it says chapter 1 and perhaps 2. But he certainly cursed the day he was born. And what also seems to be true is that he cursed the creation that made it possible for him to be born. He didn't get to the point of cursing God. But this is a lament of someone so deep in suffering that all he can see is that suffering and can't see anything beyond it. So you read things like, annul the day I was born and the night that said a man is conceived. Let there be darkness. Let God not seek it out, nor brightness shine on it. Let darkness, death shadow, follow it. And then throughout you've got these metaphors of birth, death, of darkness, of stars, of song, of weather, of eyelids of the dawn, I'll read those. Those are things that are going to come up again. And they come up in an entirely different mode, but it's there. So it's, I think, picks up this, that the whirlwind may not be answering all of Job's challenges, but he's answering the deep suffering and what the deep suffering has done to Job. So let's just read the passage. Start with, say, verse 6. That night, let murk overtake it. Let it not join in the days of the year. Let it not enter the number of months. Oh, that the night be barren, and that it have no song of joy. Let the day cursers hex it, those ready to rouse Leviathan. We'll see Leviathan later. Let the twilight stars go dark. Let it hope for day in vain, and let not the eyelids of dawn, let it not see the eyelids of dawn. These metaphors, and again, for it didn't shut the belly's door. This is the giving birth. Keep this chapter in mind when you read chapter 38, because there seems to be a significant addressing of Job's condition by God in that. At least I want to suggest that.
And the only other thing I'll hold up here is that as you read, right, annul the day I was born and the night that said a man is conceived. In other words, cursing the day that you're born. For Job is not cursing God.
No.
But again, you as the reader, because of the presence of the fable, have to hear that as a curse of God. Because you know why this happened. Right? So there's a tremendous twofold effect here. Go ahead.
I want to shift now so I see three other really deep themes that we just sort of hold up, and we'll address them, or at least the response to them next time. One of them is that throughout these speeches, Job protests his innocence and his integrity again and again and again. Against his friends, he says, you say suffering is the evidence of guilt. Well, you're the guilty ones too. But more importantly, he says, if that's the principle, then God's unjust, because I'm not guilty. I don't have those faults. That's what some of the theologians call his arrogance, right? But he's saying, I don't have those faults. So he's protesting his innocence. But much more importantly, it seems to me, two other themes are connected to that. One is God is hidden. And I'll come to that in a moment. And the other is, even though God is hidden, Job is demanding a hearing before God. Those three things, or four things: God's, his suffering, Job's suffering, his protesting of innocence, this sense that God's been hidden, and that he demands a hearing. So you can look at chapter 9 in one of the texts in front of you. Let me just read some of it, because again, the language is so powerful and so evocative, but also very important. It keeps echoing through much of the rest of the poetry. This is right, verse 2, how can man be right before God? Should a person bring grievance against him? He will not answer one of 1,000. Wise in mind, staunch in strength, who can argue with him and come out whole? He uproots mountains and they know not. He overturns his wrath. Now this is a powerful description of God's creative power. So he makes the earth shake in its setting, and its pillars shudder. He bids the sun not to rise, and the stars he seals up tight. He stretches the heavens alone and tramples the crests of the sea. He makes, now we go to the stars. He makes the Bear and Orion, Pleiades, and the south wind's chambers. He performs great things without limit and wonders without number. Then I'll just jump down to 14. Despite all of that, yet for me, I would answer him. I would choose my words with him. though in the right, I can't make my plea. I would have to entreat my own judge. We'll talk about the mediator in a moment. I would not trust him to heed my voice, for who for a hair would crush me, or Alter says anyway, in a storm would crush me and make my wounds for naught. He doesn't allow me to catch my breath. He sates me with bitterness. If its strength is staunch, if he is staunch, and if it's justice, who can arraign him, that is God? Though in the right, my mouth would convict me, I'm blameless, and yet he makes my words come out against me. God can't be trusted. God just can't be trusted. And he goes on to say, you know what he does? He blames the wicked and the blameless. And if it's not God, who else? That is, Job does not shun or avoid saying, God's involved in this. And then it comes to let's look at 29. I will be,
Verse 29.
verse 29, yes, or 28 actually. I was in terror of all my suffering. I knew you would not acquit me. I will be guilty. Why should I toil in vain? Argue. Then to 32. For he is not a man, God, not a man like me that I might answer him, that we might come together in court. Would that there were an arbiter, a mediator, that could stand between us. Bring the mediator to me. And then he ends up the chapter saying, I would speak and I will not fear him, for that is not the way I am. This is the most powerful expression of Job's integrity that he can make. Now, of course, this arbiter business, mediator, for Christians, if we ever listen to the Messiah, we know that passage from chapter 19. I know my Redeemer liveth, and all that sort of thing. What Job is calling for is someone to step in between himself and what he judges to be an utterly partial, vindictive God.
Also in chapter 9, right, and Kushner points this out, if you look at verse 21, is what are the consequences of living in that world, right? Where he says, I am blameless, I am distraught, I am sick of life.
Right.
It is all one, therefore I say, right? He destroys the blameless and the guilty. So this living in this world without an umpire, where God is inaccessible and where I experience tremendous unfair, the tremendous injustice, brings me to the point of despair.
Right. And there are other places where it's very clear, he makes it clear himself, that what this suffering has done to him has not only disoriented him, but it's isolated himself from everyone else. He's utterly alienated from everyone else. Not surprising that he feels alienated from God as well.
And I'll just say, Kushner points out this line in verse 24, Eretz nitna b'yad rasha, the earth is handed over to the wicked one. For Jews studying now, it certainly evokes the Holocaust, right? This line, right, if nothing else, is a description of that experience of the earth being handed over to of utter evil, right? Utter evil, and therefore, giving voice to that experience.
Just one more passage, we can't continue very much longer. I want to look at chapter 23, which is also a text.
Before you jump forward, I'm gonna throw one of my favorites in, and then you have the last word with chapter 23. And Jack, you can feel free to jump in if you think I'm getting this right or wrong. Okay. In chapter 7, verse 20, the line is, if I have sinned, well, going back to verse 17, right, is this ma'enosh ki tigadlenu. What is man that you make much of him? This idea that, you know what, God's attention is really not such a great experience, right? I would rather be an insignificant fly and just sort of, go about my business and not have God paying so much attention to me. Which, by the way, if you're the reader, right, then you're saying to Job, right, right? Like, it would have been much better if God had just not noticed, right? Not noticed that you were being such a good guy. And so Job says, will you not look away? Please, look away. I don't want to be the subject of all this. And Jackie, my particular question is, it says, Chatati ma'efalach, which means if I have sinned, what have I done to you? And then Job says to God, Notzer ha'adam, okay? Which, when I hear that, right, the phrase that this rhymes with is Yotzer ha'adam. Okay, God is described, Yotzer ha'adam means God is the creator of human beings, right? But Job calls him Notzer ha'adam, which means the watcher of human beings. Right? You're not a creator of human beings. You watch over human beings, and when you watch over them, you torture them. Right? I experienced this whole thing. Right? Jack, do you think I'm overreaching here by hearing in the voice the rhyme and the irony of the Hebrew that Job is just saying? Notes here, it's almost, you can hear him cursing.
Yeah.
Basically, Job's reaction are tempered by a very great anger that he cannot bring out until the last portions. So his way of dealing with it is to often enough hide behind plays on words. And he does that often enough so that he does not confront God, because after all, God is God. So basically, whatever you are saying is absolutely worth following, because all these games are in fact ways of reacting and making distancing between what he is. Because after all, at the end, Job tells him, you're not human beings, so you can't even deal as a human being with issues. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What?
He hides behind these.
He hides behind these word plays, right? And he, right, again, so you're hearing Yotzer, right? And Notzer, and he's not calling God wicked, right? But again, being watched by God here is not something that you are happy about, right? And there's a certain irony, right, that I hear when I read that phrase. Go ahead, and then we'll have to finish.
Yeah, that thought actually is interesting here, because I want to look at chapter 23. I mean, what you find through these speeches is it's not as if, here's going to take up this theme, and then he'll take up that theme, he'll take up another one in different chapters. They're all tumbling over each other. Chapter 23, again, we get a couple of things, but here in the clearest form is a statement of Job's feeling God's distance, God's hiding. So let's read again. Job spoke up and he said, even now my complaint is defiant. God's hand lies heavy as I groan. Would that I knew how to find him, that I might come to where he dwells. Then I could lay out my case before him and would fill my mouth with contentions. I would know the words that he answered to me and would grasp what he said to me. With what great power would he debate me? No, he alone would pay heed to me. There the upright can contend with him. I would get away for all time from my judge. And here's the part I wanted to hold up. Look, to the east I go, and he is not there. To the west, and I do not discern him. To the north, where he acts, and behold him not. He veils the south, and I don't see him. I cannot help, when reading that, to think of Psalm 139. One of the most powerful, to me, comforting psalms. And it goes like this. I'll read 7. You don't have it in your text. From behind and in front, you shaped me. This is actually picking up the theme, but it just turns the whole thing around. You shaped me and you set your palm upon me. Knowledge is too wondrous for me. High above, I cannot attain it. Where can I go from your spirit? And where from before you flee? If I soar to the heavens, you are there. If I bed down in Sheol, you are there. If I take wing with the dawn, if I dwell at the end of the sea, there too your hand leads me and your right hand seizes me. Notice how Job has just taken that, absolutely turned around.
And the opening line of the song, "Oh Lord, you have examined me and know."
That's right. That's right. You didn't know.
Here the knowing.
That's right.
Okay? Here the knowing is comfort and goodness.
Yeah. And there's nowhere. So I always read this with this irony of, yeah, but you can't get away from him either. But this really is a psalm of comfort. There's nowhere that you can be, no condition you can be in, that God's not present. Job is pleading for it. Pleading for that. And the way he takes it, because he's defiant yet, is I want to make my case. But what it seems to be much deeper is he's saying, I want you to know I'm suffering. Not, I want to indict you for crimes. I want you to know I'm suffering. That comes, I think, most strongly in chapter 23. There are other places where that kind of thing comes through.
And I think that the larger goals when I read Job, I think that the larger goals of the book are precisely that. Right? In other words, the book, I wonder what it's like for us to think of the book as a project in making suffering known. Right? The Job's pleas and the poetry are themselves the great project of the book.
That's good. That's good. And maybe I could add something to that. What I take from these themes is something that I don't see in the friends' speeches. And that is Job never doubts the existence of God. Never doubts that God, he's in relationship to God. It's just that God isn't around, that he's missing, that he's hidden, that he's alien, that he's an enemy. But throughout all the challenge, all these accusations, all this blasphemy, it's as if a friend or a spouse or a child says, how can you do this to me? We've been through so much together. That is, underlying this all is, to me, the message, there's a relationship here, I just can't understand it anymore. I want that relationship back. I want it so desperately that I'm gonna do terrible things. I'm gonna say I hate you. Think of the child. I hate you. It's not the hate. Saying something else. He wants that response.
I'll conclude with a couple of responses to that. Number one, there's a place, and I don't have it right in front of me, but where Job says, my friends have betrayed me like a vadi. Okay, and a vadi, for those, by the way, at 2:00 we had a Zoom call about an interfaith trip to Israel, possibly this summer. And I mention it because when you go to the Middle East, a vadi is the dry riverbed. right?
Oh, yeah. Right.
That it's dry, and then all of a sudden, right? And the idea there, Job is saying, I went to where I expected there to be a river, and then there was nothing, right? It was dry. So he's saying, you've betrayed me. I was going to you for sustenance, and what did I get? I got nothing. Right? You were parched like a dry riverbed in the desert. I think that Job's friends, you know, the way that I read the inside of the book is that they begin by acknowledging him, right? Well, you're mid-story, right? You're a righteous guy. That's going to protect you in the end. You just must have done some things, right? And Job's response, right, of, look, I'm innocent, right? And by the way, we as the reader know he's right? I'm innocent. And what the way I experience them is that the friends double down and triple down and more on, we can't let go of the equation that you must deserve this. And the more that they can't let go of that equation, right, that the good are rewarded and the evil and the wicked are punished, and therefore the less Job is seen. And all he's doing is he's crying out, God is supposed to see me when you guys can't, right? And so God, come on, right? You know what the deal is, right? But our task, right? And here I would, the pastoral piece, and I want to finish just by saying to Joe that the beauty that you gave me in that moment 12 years ago, as a Jew walking into a church to grieve one of my best friends, was being seen, right? And I think that that is our task, and it's where I think that ultimately is where the friends fail. It's not that every piece of their theology, you know what, it is good to note sometimes that we're mid-story. Right? We can hold on to things too much in the moment and not see a bigger picture. But that should never come at the cost of, I don't see you.
Right, and we are at the point, if you would read up to chapter 31, verse 35 and a little bit thereafter, what Job says is, I gotta have this hearing. And he does something which we take to be the equivalent in that culture of throwing down a gauntlet or making an oath that puts God on trial.
And we are going to pick up next week. I'm going to, in my introduction and for my travels in the Middle East, in particularly in Morocco, I'll say more about oath taking because it's not just a thing from the ancient past. And then we're going to really focus on chapters 38 to 42.
That's right.
So we want you to read it all, but if you can't read it all, read 38 to 42.
Right.
And we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much.